Alright, what's up everybody? With it being mid-March already, if you haven't started thinking about this season's beekeeping management plan, it's definitely time to do so. One big thing at this point in the year is going to be feeding, especially at this time here in Michigan, with the way that our winters have been going the last couple of seasons. It's hard to really gauge the weather. Um, but you definitely want to start feeding and thinking about it before things start blooming this spring. This is a really dangerous time for colonies. A lot of times people will relax thinking that, oh, my bees made it through winter, spring's right around the corner, it will be fine. But this is right when a lot of colonies run out of food because of the temperature fluctuations. Uh, a lot of colonies are more active during that time, so they're going to be eating more food. When they eat more food and then we get a cold snap, they get called back to the colonies. And then the next little period of warm that we get, they're out and about trying to forage again. However, they're not finding anything and they already ate their food. So it's not a great time for them. The two main ways to feed are a dry feed and wet feed. The two types of dry feed are a pollen patty or just a straight sugar brick. For wet feed, it's just a basic sugar syrup, and within that, you have different categories as well. We're going to go over the sugar syrup first. At this point in the year, with the freezing and warming, you don't really want to feed a sugar syrup because it can freeze as well. Um, and not just a hardening of the syrup, but it'll actually, depending on what it is in the solution, can freeze. Some commercially bought sugar syrups won't freeze because of the additives and the chemicals and things in them, but most will, and especially if you're making it at home, it will. However, there's the three main categories that I use for syrup feeding is 3-to-1, 2-to-1, and 1-to-1. And I had to make some notes so I got it all right for you guys. With a 1-to-1, it's a 1 pound of water to 1 pound of sugar ratio, expanded as needed to scale. The 1-to-1 ratio is really good for early spring feeding after the dangers of the last freeze. That mimics the early spring nectar flow and will get the bees up and active pretty easy. It gives them, with it being a thinner syrup, it gives them something, they have to work harder to dry it out and use it. So it also keeps them busy. A 2-to-1 is a 2 pounds of sugar to 1 pound of water, and scale is needed. And that's really good for, with it being a little bit thicker, it's good for fall feeding to pack on some weight fairly quickly, but also still liquid enough to give your bees something to work on. A 3-to-1 ratio is 1 pound of water to 3 pounds of sugar. And of course, with the more sugar you add, the longer you have to stir it and keep it on the heat and on the stove. It takes a little longer to dissolve, to superheat and dissolve that way. But 3-to-1 is really great for emergency feeding, swarms, and cutout colonies. You really want to pack on some weight to them, make sure they have food and that they're going to, give them that boost of energy to do the other necessary things that they need to do to build the colony. And it's a great boost for them. They don't have to work very hard to dry it out and condense it down to make it usable for themselves, so it's quick energy. With the dry feeding, you have your straight sugar brick, which is essentially, you can take a bag of sugar, wet it down a little bit, let it get hard and dry, and just stick the whole thing in the hive, the top of your hive. The bees will eat through the paper and get into the sugar as they need to, or you should cut some slits into it a little bit so they can get in there a little easier, but it doesn't really matter either way. With pollen patties, especially in early spring, it's a great resource because it has some of that added nutrients that the bees need. The sugar is great, but it's a lot like a human eating pizza only forever. It's doable, but it's not going to be great on your guts and your body. So the pollen patty is a good thing to do. The main recipe that I use, there's all kinds of recipes out there that you can use. There's commercially bought ones that you can get. I think Better Bee makes a pollen patty mixture, and there's a couple others. But the one that I use is a 2-to-1. You make it in two parts. I mix my dry ingredients together, and then I mix my wet ingredient base together, and then I put the dry ingredients into the base. So for the base, the wet ingredient base, it's a 2-to-1 sugar syrup solution. So 2 pounds of water, or sorry, 2 pounds of sugar to 1 pound of water. I mix that together, superheat it, make sure it's completely dissolved. So when you stir, you can see through like it's straight water, there's no cloudiness. Set that aside and let that cool a little bit while you mix your dry ingredients. For the dry ingredients, I use 226 grams of soy flour. You can use regular flour, however, the consistency that you get is not going to be quite the same. The soy flour tends to have a little bit more minerals, a little more salt in it too, depending on what brand you get. So I use soy flour. 28 grams of brewer's yeast, which is just a couple packets. And you don't have to get like the high dollar fancy stuff. The stuff that you get at most general health food stores is fine, and even regular bread yeast it works. So, and then another 340 grams of sugar. So you mix all of your dry ingredients together in a bowl or whatnot, and then so it's completely mixed through all the way. It makes it easier to mix into the sugar water and get everything saturated that way. And when you put your dry ingredients into your sugar water, you mix it and knead it until it's about the consistency of bread dough or so. Pull it out, put it on some wax paper, kind of spread it out, get the shape and thickness that you want. Put another piece of wax paper on top of it. At that point, I go ahead, once it's fairly cool, and I go ahead and cut it into like package size pieces that I want. Typically, I use my hand to measure, and it ends up being about a pound and a half per patty on average. And so I cut them into sections. I stack the sections on top of each other. I just wrap them in a bag, Ziploc bag or airtight container or tote of some sort, and just stick them in your freezer until you need them. The freezer will just prolong the shelf life, if you don't want to use them right away. I do recommend, if you don't put it in the freezer, I do recommend using it within the first week or so, definitely, because the yeast will continue to react, and of course with the moisture and things being at room temperature, mold has the potential to grow. So if you don't use it right away, freeze it. But those are a couple of really easy, quick things to think about when you're feeding. You can do the pollen patty on top of your sugar syrup when temperatures are at that point where you can do it. Right now, we are still getting the freeze-thaw kind of cycle going, so I would definitely recommend a pollen patty or a sugar brick. If you have any other questions, definitely let me know in the future, and we'll see what we can do.